Aliens had crushed every species they captured. Then they bought 4 humans. Forge of the Damned. The chain around my wrist was cold. Not uncomfortable, just cold. The way metal gets when it has been sitting in recycled ship air for 14 months with no sun to warm it. I had stopped noticing it the way you stop noticing a scar. It was just there, a part of my arm now, as ordinary as my knuckles or the grease lines under my fingernails that never fully washed out no matter how hard I scrubbed. My name is Marcus Hale. I was a machinist on Earth's northern orbital shipyard before any of this happened. I built things. Big things, precise things. Things that had to work the first time because the first time was usually the only time you got. I repaired engines the size of apartment buildings and calibrated tolerances measured in fractions of a hair's width, and I had never once, in 15 years of that work, looked at a broken machine and decided it was not worth understanding. Now I sat in the cargo hold of a Vorkai trade vessel and listened to the sounds a starship makes when it slows down, a low, grinding hum that started in the floor and moved up through your spine like a warning. And I told myself the same thing I had been telling myself for the past 4 days. Stay calm, watch everything, and do not do anything that cannot be undone. The hold smelled like recycled fear. That is the only way I can describe it. 14 species worth of biological stress chemicals mixing together in a sealed space with imperfect air filtration. Some of those smells were sweet in a way that made your eyes water. Some were sharp, like copper heated too quickly. A few were things I had no reference for at all, things my brain filed under wrong and left there because there was no better category available. There were 6 of us in the hold when I first woke up on this ship. Now there were 4. I did not think about the other 2. Not then. Thinking about them would not bring them back, and it would make the cold feeling in my chest spread, and I needed to be able to breathe without it hurting. Yemi Adeyemi was sitting to my left, cross-legged on the metal floor, with her eyes half closed. She was not sleeping. I had learned the difference early. When Yemi slept, her breathing went slow and deep, and her head tilted slightly to the right. When she was thinking, she went still like that. Still like a machine that had been paused mid-cycle. All the energy still running somewhere inside, just not visible on the surface. She had been an aerospace engineer back home, the best one I had ever personally met, and I had met a few. She thought in systems. She looked at the world and saw how every part connected to every other part, and then the connections between those connections, all the way down to the smallest moving piece. Riku Tanaka was against the far wall with his back straight and his hands resting on his knees. He was the quietest of us, which surprised people when they first met him, because he had the kind of face that looked like it should belong to someone who told a lot of jokes. Wide mouth, expressive eyes, a way of tilting his head that made him seem permanently curious about whatever was in front of him. But Riku was a trauma surgeon. And trauma surgeons are not actually calm people. They are people who have trained themselves to perform calm so perfectly that it becomes indistinguishable from the real thing. I trusted Riku more than almost anyone I had ever known, precisely because his calm was chosen. It was a decision he made every single moment, consciously, deliberately, and he never stopped making it, even when every reasonable instinct said stop. Dana Kowalski was pacing. She had been pacing since the ship slowed down. 7 steps one way, turn, 7 steps back, precise as a metronome. She was ex-Marine, an explosive ordnance specialist, and she had a relationship with enclosed spaces that she described as complicated, and I would describe as something closer to a negotiation, conducted daily, and not always won. She kept the pacing controlled, though. Kowalski always kept things controlled. She had short red hair and a jaw that looked like it had been carved out of something harder than bone, and she had not cried once in 14 months. Not because she did not feel things. I think she felt them very intensely. She just filed them somewhere internal and let them sit there until she had space to deal with them properly, and 14 months had not given her that space yet. The viewport in the hold was small and reinforced, and had a crack along one edge that the Vorkai had not bothered to repair because it was not worth their time. I had spent hours at that crack, watching the stars move, trying to stay oriented. Now what I saw was not stars. It was a station, enormous, sprawling, the kind of structure that makes you feel your own smallness, in a way that is almost philosophical. Docking arms reached out in every direction like the fingers of something that had grown without a plan, without an architect, just layer upon layer of function added over decades, until the original shape was completely invisible. Ships of a dozen designs were attached, or circling in holding patterns. Lights moved along the station's surface in organized flows, marking transit lanes and loading zones and access corridors. Commerce, industry, the ordinary, uninterrupted business of a galaxy that had figured out its own economics long before it found us. I had heard about the Vorkai Sovereign Exchange before my capture. Everyone who worked the orbital yards had heard about it, the way you hear about a storm that has not reached your coast yet, but that everyone knows is coming. The Vorkai had been collecting species for 40 years by the time they reached Earth. 17 species in total, each one catalogued, assessed for value, and put to work in whatever role their biology made them useful for. They did not destroy the species they took. Destruction was inefficient. You could not extract value from a thing you had destroyed. What they did instead was methodical and patient, and in many ways considerably worse than simple destruction. The hold doors opened. 3 Vorkai handlers came in, wearing the dull gray uniforms of lower-rank logistics staff. They were tall, about 2.5 meters, with joints that bent in directions mine did not, and skin the color of old slate that had been left in the weather too long. Their faces were flat and wide, with large eyes that reflected light strangely, like the eyes of certain deep-water fish. They never showed expression in any way I could read. I had been trying to learn their expressions for 14 months, watching every interaction I was permitted to observe, and I had made very little reliable progress. They unchained us from the wall anchors. They left the wrist cuffs on but clipped new leads to them, shorter ones, and guided us out of the hold and through a series of corridors that smelled differently from each other, because the ship's ventilation was localized, and each section had its own particular character. Cold metal, warm circuitry, something that might have been chemical coolant and something else that was sweet in a way that did not seem to come from any source I could identify. We were brought to a staging area. It was large, and there were other beings there, members of other species. Some I recognized from the databases that had been circulated among the orbital yards after first contact. Some I had never seen before. A cluster of small, pale creatures that moved in tight formations and communicated through rapid sequences of clicks and light patterns emitted from patches along their upper limbs. A single individual of a species I had no name for, large and heavily built, with a settled stillness about it that I found oddly comforting, like the stillness of very old machinery that has learned not to waste motion. Several Thereni, whose bodies produced faint bioluminescence in shifting patterns of blue and green, and who were known for being extraordinarily capable at fine detail work and extraordinarily sensitive to disappointment in ways that seemed to cause them genuine physical distress. I watched them all the way I had been watching everything for 14 months. Not aggressively, just persistently. The auction itself happened in a chamber we were not permitted to enter. We heard it through a translation system that piped the proceedings into the staging area through a speaker mounted near the ceiling. The auctioneer's voice was mechanical and flat in the translated version, a voice stripped of tone, because tone does not always survive species-to-species conversion without becoming something unintentionally misleading. I listened to the Thereni go first. The bidding was quick and decisive. They were purchased in a group by something called the Consolidated Ornamentation Houses of Pelith. Decorative labor, exactly the role that their bioluminescence and fine motor control had marked them for. They communicated nothing as they were let out. The light patterns under their skin had gone still and cold. The Sketh went next, 5 of them, fast and wiry, and capable of processing information at speeds that human neurology could not match without chemical assistance. They were bought by a logistics conglomerate that needed couriers who could navigate complex physical environments and make real-time routing decisions faster than automated systems. Courier work, the kind of work that would use up their bodies in a decade and maybe less. One by one, the species moved through the system, assessed and allocated with the efficiency of a supply chain that had been running long enough to have all the rough edges worn smooth. Each sale was followed by the sounds of beings being led away, and then a silence before the next announcement. Then it was us. I heard the auctioneer begin with what was apparently a standard species summary. I will not repeat it in full. The summary was not kind, and it was not wrong about most of the specific facts it cited. Humans were physically unremarkable compared to most of the other species in the staging area. We did not have enhanced sensory capability. We did not have natural armor or chemical defense, or the kind of information processing speed the Sketh carried in their nervous systems. We had moderate strength, moderate endurance, a biology that was not yet well understood because we had been acquired relatively recently, and no established record of specialized utility. The report did include one note that I found interesting, even in that moment in the staging area with the cold lead on my wrist. A Vorkai field agent had observed human subjects during the initial capture period and noted what the report called an unusual persistence behavior. The subjects continued attempting solutions to problems even after repeated failure, and did not naturally reroute to established alternative pathways in the way that other species consistently did. The agent had flagged this as potentially significant, but had not pursued the observation further, because pursuing potentially significant observations was not in the agent's job description. The agent's job description involved filing reports, and the report had been filed, and that was where the matter had rested. Silence from the bidding gallery. Long silence. I looked at Kowalski. She had stopped pacing. She looked back at me with an expression that I had learned, over 14 months, was her version of concern. Yemi had opened her eyes. Riku had not moved, but something in the set of his shoulders had shifted almost imperceptibly. More silence. Then one voice, a single bidder. The tone that came through the translator was dry and deliberate, carrying the particular quality of someone making a purchase that did not excite them, but that they had decided, after calculation, was rational. The number that followed was so low that the auctioneer repeated it twice, apparently to confirm that it had been transmitted correctly. I found out later, from a source I will not identify here because identifying them would complicate their situation, that the number was the lowest price ever recorded at the Vorkai Sovereign Exchange for any sentient biological entity in 40 years of operation. Scrap value. The price you pay for something you intend to pull apart and see what is inside. The voice belonged to a being called Gorzan, fabricator lord of the Caliph Empire, third in seniority among the industrial architects of the Dravit sector, holder of 14 active major construction contracts, and owner of one of the largest and most productive weapons manufacturing facilities in the known territories of the Empire. He did not come to see us in person until we were already loaded onto his transport, and the station's gravity had been replaced by the ship's internal system. When he did come, he stood in the doorway of the hold and looked at the four of us for a long time without speaking. He was smaller than I had expected from the authority his title implied, lean, with 4 arms, 2 primary and 2 secondary, and a face that was narrow and angular and gave away very little. His eyes were dark and very steady. He did not look at us with contempt, or hunger, or the sharp curiosity of someone encountering something they had never seen before. He looked at us the way a craftsman looks at raw material, not with cruelty, but with a specific, measured attention that is already somewhere ahead of the present moment, already calculating what the material might become under the right conditions. He did not speak to us. He looked for a while, and then he left. Yemi waited until the sound of his footsteps had faded completely. Then she leaned toward me, her voice very low. "He is not interested in what we are," she said. "He is not interested in what we are," she said. "He is interested in what we are," she said. I thought about the auctioneer's report, the field agent's footnote, the unusual persistence behavior, a detail so small that the agent who wrote it down had not considered it worth following. "He read the footnote," I said. Yemi was quiet for a moment. "Then we had better make sure the footnote was right." The moon was called Dravate 4. It did not have a more interesting name than that, because the Caliph did not name things for sentiment, or for beauty, or for the stories attached to discovery. They named things for location and function. Dravit 4 was the 4th significant body orbiting the gas giant Dravit, and its function was industrial, and that was all the naming it needed. From the transport window, as we descended through the upper atmosphere, it looked like a dark smear against the deep orange of the gas giant behind it. Then the clouds broke and the forge came into view, and for a moment, just one, quickly controlled, I forgot to breathe. It was vast in a way that made the word vast seem like a significant understatement. The facility spread across the moon's equatorial plateau in every direction, more city than building, a sprawling complex of manufacturing towers and launch rails and cooling arrays and transit corridors that connected everything to everything else, in a web of function too large to take in all at once. Smoke and vapor rose from dozens of exhaust points in columns that leaned with the moon's thin wind. Lights ran along every major surface in organized patterns, marking transit routes and loading zones and safety perimeters. Automated transport vehicles moved between structures in continuous streams, carrying components and materials, and finished sections of things that were too large to assemble inside any single building. The whole thing glowed faintly in the dark, visible from orbit the way a city is visible from high altitude, a geometry of function that was too large to be beautiful in any traditional sense, but that had the particular beauty of things that work, of things built to purpose and running at full capacity, without wasted motion. I was a machinist. I had worked on some of the largest structures humanity had ever attempted. The orbital yards themselves were enormous, designed to hold ships the size of city blocks, while they were built piece by piece, over years of continuous labor. And the forge made the orbital yards look like models built by students on a limited budget, which was an unsettling thing to look at for the first time. We were processed into the facility, without ceremony or delay. The cuffs were changed for a different kind, lighter, less restrictive, keyed to zones rather than used as direct restraints. We could move within our assigned quarters and a limited connected work area. We could not approach the outer perimeter, or the classified manufacturing sections that comprised the forge's most sensitive production. The zone system was explained to us by a junior Calith administrator, who spoke to us the way you speak to equipment you are not certain is intelligent enough to follow complex instructions, which is to say he spoke slowly and repeated each point twice, and used simpler words than the situation required. I understood everything the first time. I did not correct him. Our quarters were 4 connected rooms, small but functional. The surfaces were designed for Calith physiology, for beings with 4 arms and different ergonomic requirements, and we adapted every piece of them to human use within the first day, moving things, improvising substitutes for what was not available, making the space work for bodies that were the wrong shape for it. Yemi immediately began mapping the ventilation system of our zone, not because she was planning anything involving the ventilation, but because knowing a building's ventilation was how she started to understand a building. Riku located the medical supply cache inside the first hour, and cataloged every item in it, with the careful, methodical attention he gave to everything clinical. Kowalski walked the full perimeter of our assigned zone 17 times by my count, and then drew it from memory on the wall of her room, in a substance she had scraped from the underside of one of the shelves. I found the machine shop. It was not our machine shop. It was a facility maintenance bay that sat adjacent to our zone, separated by a transparent partition through which I could see everything inside but could not access. Rows of equipment were visible from my side: fabrication tools, cutting instruments, measuring devices, things I could not name but whose function I could derive from their shape and their placement relative to each other. Many of them were analogs to tools I had used at the orbital yards, designed for 4-armed operation and calibrated to different standards, but recognizable in their purpose, the way all tools are recognizable to someone who has spent enough time thinking about what tools are fundamentally for. I stood at that partition for a long time the first night, in the dark, when the forge's ambient noise had settled into its overnight register, lower, steadier, the sound of continuous production without the additional layers of shift change activity. I stood there and looked at the tools and thought about what they were capable of, and what I was capable of, and the distance between those two things that the partition represented. On the 3rd day, Gorzin came. He came without a significant entourage, which I had not expected given his rank. He came with a single aide who stood at the back of our quarters and recorded everything on a device worn at the wrist, and Gorzin himself moved through the rooms with that same measured attention he had shown on the transport, examining the changes we had made to the space, the repositioned surfaces, the improvised ergonomic solutions, the map Kowalski had drawn on her wall. He stood in front of that map for a considerable time. "You mapped the zone," he said. His translator was built into a small device at his collar, and the voice that came from it was clear and level, with less of the mechanical flatness of the staging area system. "Habit," Kowalski said. "What is the purpose of the habit?" She looked at him directly, which was not something most beings did when looking at a fabricator lord. When you know exactly where the walls are, they stop feeling like they are moving toward you. He considered that for a moment, in a way that suggested he was filing it carefully, rather than simply dismissing it. Then he turned to address all 4 of us. "I am going to give each of you a problem," he said. "You will have 3 days. Each problem has been assigned previously to Calith technical specialists. None of them succeeded. Each problem has been formally declared unsolvable by established methods. What kind of problems? Yemi asked. Mechanical failures. Equipment that has ceased to function correctly. In each case, the original design schematics are unavailable. In each case, the assigned engineers determined that without the schematics, successful repair was not achievable. He paused. I had the distinct sense he was watching our reactions with a precision that matched the measuring equipment on the other side of the partition. I want to see what you do when the standard path does not exist. This was the test. I understood that immediately and clearly. Not a test of whether we could fix the machines, a test of whether we did what the field agent's footnote had described, whether we kept attempting when the established method had been exhausted and nothing else had been provided. My machine was a plasma mill spindle. It sat in a cleared space in the maintenance bay, about the size of a large dining table, a rotating precision component from one of the major manufacturing lines. The rotation mechanism had seized completely. The power coupling had fused in a way consistent with a serious thermal event at some point in the machine's history. The surface showed discoloration and scoring from sustained heat exposure. 3 Calith engineers had examined it at different points, determined that without the original calibration schematics, they could not establish the correct tolerances for safe disassembly, and declared it beyond repair. I sat with it for approximately 40 minutes after the Calith aide brought me into the maintenance bay and stepped back to observe. I did not ask for schematics, because asking for things that did not exist was a waste of time that I could not afford. I walked around it twice. I crouched down and looked at it from different angles. I pressed my hand flat against several surfaces and felt for the texture of the material and what the scoring patterns told me about the direction and duration of the heat event that had caused the damage. Then I got on the floor and started taking it apart. Not with a plan in the conventional sense, not with a sequence derived from documentation I did not have. With my hands and with tools I asked for by describing their function clearly and specifically to the aide who was observing, and who proved to be either under instruction to cooperate fully, or intelligent enough to recognize that cooperation was more productive than obstruction, because the aide brought each tool I described, without requiring a name I did not know, in a language I was still learning. I worked by feel and by the logic of machines, which is consistent and universal, regardless of who built them and what they were built from. Every component in any machine exists to accomplish something. It connects to the next component in a specific way that makes the accomplishing possible. If you trace the connections backward from where the failure happened, following each one carefully and without assumption, you can find where the accomplishing stopped and why. It takes considerably longer without a schematic to follow. You make more mistakes. You back up and try different approaches when an approach produces a result that does not fit the pattern you are building. You get the rotation angles wrong twice before the geometry of the assembly tells you where wrong actually is. I worked through the first day and through the night and into the second day. I ate what the aide brought without stopping work long enough to sit down properly. I slept for 4 hours on the floor of the maintenance bay, because going back to the quarters would have meant losing the physical relationship I had built with the disassembled components spread out around me in the pattern that represented my understanding of the assembly sequence. By the end of the second day, I had it fully apart, laid out on the floor, every component in a position relative to every other component that mapped the machine's logic as I had understood it. On the third day, I rebuilt it. Not perfectly. When I ran it at low speed to test the rotation, there was a resonance in the high-speed range that should not have been there, a faint vibration I could feel in my palm when I rested it against the housing at the relevant frequency. I knew where it was coming from. I noted it in detail on a piece of surface material the aide provided, describing the exact location, the frequency range where it appeared, and what I believed was causing it at the component level. I noted it because the information was useful, and useful information should be passed on, regardless of whether passing it on benefited me directly or not. The aide looked at the note for a long time. Yemi did not fix her machine. She improved it. Her assignment was an atmospheric processor that managed the chemical balance of one of the smaller interior zones. It had been running at reduced capacity for approximately 2 years, and no engineer had been able to determine why, because the reduction was gradual, a fraction of a % per month, and the original efficiency rating had been established during a period when the zone's population density was significantly different from what it currently was. The machine's performance had never been classified as a failure because it had never fully stopped functioning. It had been categorized as performing within acceptable parameters, and acceptable parameters had simply been redefined around what the machine was actually doing. Yemi read every piece of available documentation on the machine, not much, but enough to establish the original design intent, and then she watched it run for 6 consecutive hours, measuring actual output against what she calculated the output should be given the current population load and atmospheric composition requirements of the zone. She sat down with a piece of surface material and a marking tool and worked through the discrepancy until she understood it. The intake ratio had been set for a population density that no longer existed. The machine was running a correct process for parameters that were no longer accurate. The parameters had never been updated because updating them would have required acknowledging that the original setting was wrong, and the original setting had been made by engineers whose work was not typically revisited. Adjusting the intake calibration required disassembling a panel that was not designed to be opened by someone with 2 arms, and recalibrating 3 intake valves by hand using improvised measurement tools, because the calibration equipment available was keyed to a standard that this particular machine did not use. The whole process took most of a day and left Yemi with bruised knuckles and a calm expression of complete satisfaction. The machine's output efficiency increased by 18%. Not because anything was broken, because the assumption behind the configuration had been wrong for 2 years, and no one had looked at the assumption. Riku's task was a medical bay that had been decommissioned for 10 years following the failure of its primary diagnostic system. Replacement components were unavailable, and documentation for the system had been lost, and without both it had been considered non-functional. He was given access, told he had 3 days, and left. He spent the first day walking through the bay slowly, touching things with the light, exploratory touch of someone taking inventory through their fingertips. He was reading labels in a language he was still learning, identifying components by their shape and placement, and what each position in a medical bay typically meant, building a picture of the room's original intent from the physical evidence that remained after 10 years of disuse. On the second day, he began building rather than repairing. He set aside the failed diagnostic system entirely, because repairing it without unavailable parts was not a viable path, and in its place he began constructing a manual assessment system from components that were present in the facility. He calibrated it to the biological parameters of the species most commonly represented among the Forge's workforce, which he had spent weeks learning from whatever documentation he could access, and from careful observation of the beings around him. The manual system was not as fast as what it replaced. It required more time and more judgment from the person operating it. Riku did not consider either of these facts to be disadvantages. He did not decommission the bay further, he recommissioned it. And then there was Kowalski. Her task was a collapsed access tunnel in the lower manufacturing zone. A structural failure 2 years prior had caved in a 30-meter section, cutting off a secondary maintenance route. Calith structural engineers had assessed it 3 times and concluded that the collapsed section could not be safely cleared because the surrounding support structure was compromised to the point where any attempt to remove debris would trigger additional collapse in the adjacent tunnel sections. They had declared the route permanently blocked and rerouted all traffic through an alternative path that added 12 minutes to every transit between the upper and lower zones. The rerouting had been accepted as permanent. The blocked tunnel had been sealed and left. Kowalski went in, looked at the collapse for approximately 20 minutes, and then requested explosive ordnance. The Calith aide monitoring her assignment became very still, in a way I recognized from other contexts as the Calith equivalent of alarm. She did not explain her plan as a comfort. She explained it as technical information, because technical information was what the situation required. She explained, in the precise and specific language she had developed over 14 months of listening hard and another several weeks of accelerated vocabulary acquisition, that she did not intend to clear the existing collapse. The existing collapse was, she noted, not actually the problem. The problem was the compromised support structure surrounding it. She intended to create a new collapse, controlled, precisely placed, in a section 40 meters to the west, that would relieve the loading on the compromised structure, stabilize the entire section, and allow the original debris to be cleared safely afterward. Then she intended to rebuild the tunnel using the rubble from both collapses as raw material, in a configuration that was structurally superior to what had existed before either failure. The structural engineers reviewed her plan with an intensity that suggested they were looking for flaws and having difficulty locating them. Two of them objected on the grounds that the approach required making the situation materially worse before it could be made better, and that no established engineering principle accepted deliberate worsening as a valid phase of a repair process. Kowalski did not argue the philosophical point. She explained, with the patience of someone who has been very precise and is waiting for precision to be recognized, exactly what the structural outcome would be after each phase of the plan was executed. She explained it twice. The second time she used simplified geometry sketched on the wall with a marking tool borrowed from the aid. The ordnance was provided. The new tunnel section was completed on day 4, 1 day past her official window. It was wider than the original, reinforced at the load-bearing points in a configuration that the original designers had not considered, and it reduced transit time between the upper and lower zones by 3 minutes, compared even to the pre-collapse route. The approach was not in any established manual. The approach had not existed in written form before Kowalski wrote it on a wall in a marking tool she had borrowed and not returned. On the evening of that day, Gorzin came to our quarters again. He moved through the rooms in his measuring way, and when he had finished moving through them, he stood in the center of the main space and looked at all 4 of us in turn. His face was as controlled as it always was, but I had been watching him for weeks by this point, and I had learned a small number of reliable signals. The position of his secondary arms, held close to his body, rather than relaxed outward, meant that something internal was running at a higher level than the external presentation showed. "You completed the tasks," he said. "We completed them, and then some," Kowalski said. She said it without aggression, just as a statement of fact that she thought was worth including. Gorzin looked at her for a moment with those steady, dark eyes. "Yes," he said, "and then some." He moved to the doorway. At the threshold he stopped and turned back one more time, and I have thought about what he said next, more times than I can count, in the quiet hours, in the dark, when the forge was running, and sleep was somewhere I had not been able to reach yet. "You are not what I purchased," he said. "You are something more inconvenient." Then he left. The room was quiet for a long time. Outside, the forge made its continuous sounds. The hum of production that never stopped, the low rhythm of machinery at work. It was Riku who eventually broke the silence. He asked the aide, who was finishing the day's record in the corner, what the word inconvenient carried in Kalith culture. Not the translation, the meaning, as the Kalith themselves understood it, with all the context that a translator stripped away. The aide looked at Riku, then at its recording device, then back at Riku. "In our language," it said carefully, "the closest meaning would be this: a thing that is dangerous, in a way that has not yet been classified." The aide left. The door closed. I looked at my hands. The knuckles were scraped. There was grease under my fingernails that had not been there this morning. My shoulders ached from 2 days of working at angles my body was not designed to sustain. There was a burn on the back of my right wrist from a component that had retained heat longer than I had anticipated, the kind of burn that would leave a small scar that I would probably stop noticing in a few weeks, the same way I had stopped noticing the chain. Dangerous in a way that has not yet been classified. I thought about Yemi's machine running 18% above its rated output, because someone finally looked at the assumption underneath the setting. I thought about Riku's decommissioned bay lit and functional, because he had decided the absence of the original equipment was not the same thing as the absence of a solution. I thought about Kowalski's tunnel, wider and stronger than the one before it, built from the material of its own collapse. "Well," Yemi said quietly, to no one in particular, "that is a start." It was. It was a start. And starts, in my experience, are what everything else comes from. The forge had a rhythm. Once you lived inside it long enough to feel it, you could not stop feeling it, even when you were not trying to. It moved in shifts of 9 hours. Kalith biology ran on a different cycle than human biology, and 9 hours was the administrative compromise between those two realities and the demands of a facility that could not afford to stop producing. The machines ran without pause. The workers rotated around them. The output moved from one stage to the next without interruption. I started measuring the rhythm precisely in the 5th week. Not because anyone asked me to, but because measuring things was how I understood them, and understanding the forge felt increasingly necessary in the way that understanding your environment always feels necessary when your environment is the boundary between you and everything outside it. By the 2nd month, I could identify which section of the facility was operating at any given time by the specific frequency of vibration through the floor of our quarters. By the 3rd month, I could tell you which machines in the maintenance bay adjacent to our zone were running at normal load, and which were being pushed past their rated capacity. By the 5th month, I had stopped consciously tracking these things because they had become background knowledge, the way you know when rain is coming, not because you looked at the sky, but because the air feels different. My Caliph had improved to the point where I was using it directly in most interactions, keeping the translator as a backup for technical vocabulary I was still building. Yemi's was better than mine. Riku's was more precise in the domains he needed it to be precise in, which was medical and biological terminology. Kowalski's was blunt and functional, and occasionally alarmed the people she spoke with by being unexpectedly direct, in a way that Caliph professional communication did not normally accommodate. Language opened things. Not because we used it to ask for things. We learned quickly that asking for things directly was less effective than making ourselves useful, in ways that caused things to become available without asking. Language opened things because it let us understand what was being said around us, and what was being said around us, once we could hear it, was considerably more informative than anything we were told directly. What we heard, over those months, pieced together from dozens of partial conversations and administrative communications, and the increasing willingness of the aide to speak candidly in our presence, was this. The Caliph Empire was old, not the kind of old that comes with comfort and stability. The kind of old that has been declining for long enough that the decline has become the default state, and no one clearly remembers what it felt like before the decline began. They had been the dominant industrial and military power in their sector for 200 years. In the last 40, 3 significant challenges had emerged. The Vorkai, who were growing in territorial reach and political influence, and who used aggressive acquisition of species, of resources, of technology, as their primary mechanism of expansion. A collective called the Thessian Reach, whose engineering and propulsion technology was advancing at a pace that made Caliph analysts uncomfortable, and something referred to in official documents only as the deep current, about which the information available was carefully and deliberately vague, in ways that suggested the vagueness was policy, rather than ignorance. The Caliph response to pressure from 3 directions had been to concentrate on what they had always done best. They were builders, manufacturers, the industrial spine of their region of space. If they could produce better weapons, stronger ships, and more effective military hardware faster than any competitor, they could maintain the leverage that kept the pressure manageable. Everything had gone into the forge, and facilities like it. Contracts of enormous scale, promised timelines requiring everything to work without significant failure. The project that mattered most, the one that carried the most political weight, the one that had been running longest without success, the one that kept the most senior officials in the Empire's military command watching and waiting with decreasing patience, was a new class of warship hull. The Vorkai used a weapons system called graviton shear in direct combat. The system created localized distortions in the gravitational field surrounding a target vessel, causing the hull to experience uneven force distribution from multiple directions simultaneously. In sufficient concentration and duration, this produced structural failure from within, the hull tearing itself apart under opposing forces that its materials and configuration could not reconcile. No existing Caliph hull material had been found that fully resisted it. 12 years of development, 17 material combinations, 11 structural configurations. None of it had produced a hull that passed the required resistance threshold under simulated combat conditions. Yemi found the problem in 3 days of reading the project files. She had been given access to those files, not as a courtesy, but as a result of a direct request she made to Gorzin, citing 3 specific prior instances where her work had produced better outcomes than the Caliph specialist's work, and making the argument, without anger or pressure, that excluding her from relevant data was simply inefficient. It was a difficult argument to counter on its merits, and Gorzin did not try to counter it. He gave her access. She read for 3 days. She filled more than 40 pages of her own shorthand notation during those days, working through the problem documentation from the beginning, treating 12 years of prior work not as a record of failure, but as a record of everything that had been tried, which was extremely useful information when you were trying to understand what had not been tried yet. On the fourth day, she asked to address the engineering team working on the project. I went with her, because she had asked me to come, and because I wanted to hear what she had found. The engineering team was 22 Kalith specialists. They were the best the Forge had available for this project, selected based on 12 years of rotating assignments that had kept the most effective contributors involved and moved others out. They had spent their careers on this problem. They knew it from every direction that established methods could approach it from. They had run every simulation their modeling systems could generate, tested every combination of materials their manufacturing capability could produce. They were experts in the fullest sense of the word. They were not glad to have a human standing at the front of their meeting room. This was visible in the way that expert displeasure is usually visible, not through open expression, but through small adjustments in posture and attention that communicated the same information without requiring anyone to say it directly. Yemi did not acknowledge their displeasure. She was very good at selectively perceiving the things that were useful to perceive.
The problem is not the material,
She said, in Kalith that was precise and unhedged.
The material you have been working with is adequate. It has the necessary strength properties. The problem is the assumption that underlies your configuration approach.
The lead engineer, a being named Telrock who had been assigned to this project for 6 years, and who had an air of someone who had stopped expecting solutions and started expecting continuation, said something that the translator rendered as, "The configuration has been optimized to the maximum structural coherence achievable with every material combination tested." Yes, Yemi said. Optimized for perfect force distribution. Every plating section aligned to share load as evenly as the geometry allows. Every joint calibrated for maximum structural coherence. The entire hull conceived as a unified system, so that when external force is applied, the hull responds as a single unified entity. She let that sit for a moment. When graviton shear is applied to a perfectly unified hull, the entire hull receives the distortion simultaneously, because you have designed the force distribution so well, because the whole system is so coherent. The shear propagates through the entire structure at once. You have designed the hull to be maximally vulnerable to the specific type of force it most needs to resist, because graviton shear specifically exploits unified structural response. The room was not silent, but it was quieter than it had been a moment before. The solution is controlled discontinuity. You need to introduce deliberate misalignment into the plating, boundaries between sections that are intentionally not in structural resonance with each other. When the shear encounters these boundaries, it loses coherence. Instead of propagating through the whole structure simultaneously, it encounters interference points. It dissipates. The engineer sitting to Telrock's left said something the translator rendered as, "No established engineering philosophy would introduce deliberate structural imperfection into a military-grade hull. Human engineering does," Yemi said. She did not say it as a boast. She said it the way you state a relevant fact. We design for good enough under actual conditions, rather than for perfect under ideal conditions. A system optimized for perfect performance under ideal conditions fails when conditions become something other than ideal. A system designed to handle imperfect conditions continues to function because imperfect conditions are what it was built for. Telrock looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at his modeling terminal. Then, slowly, with the careful deliberateness of someone testing ice they are not certain will hold, he began entering parameters. The simulation ran for 47 minutes. The room was quiet for most of that time, which was not the normal state of a room containing 22 engineers who had opinions about everything. The result was not a perfect result. Simulations of complex military systems do not produce perfect results. But it was a result that had not been achieved in 12 years of prior work. The modeled hull, with deliberate misalignment built into the plating structure, according to the parameters Yemi specified, absorbed graviton shear at a rate significantly better than anything previously achieved, not marginally better. Measurably, clearly, demonstrably better, in a way that would survive critical examination. Telrock looked at the simulation output for a long time. Then he looked at Yemi, and then, because he was, Underneath the expertise and the years of calcified expectation, genuinely a scientist, he asked a question. A precise, technical question about optimal spacing parameters for the discontinuities, phrased in a way that assumed Yemi's approach was correct, and was asking how to implement it most effectively. That was the Calith version of I believe you. It was a more useful version than the human one would have been. The news of what had happened in that meeting room moved through the Forge's administrative network faster than I would have predicted. By the end of the day, the story had reached 3 levels of administration above the engineering team. By the following day, it had reached the Oversight Council, 7 senior Calith officials responsible for Forge operations, and reporting upward to military and industrial command. Their reaction was not what I would have expected from beings who had just watched a 12-year failure begin to resolve. Their reaction was something closer to alarm, which I found instructive. Slaves were not supposed to solve what masters could not solve. This was not a written principle that anyone cited or defended openly. It was something more fundamental than a written rule. It was an assumption so deeply embedded in the structure of the system that most of the people operating within the system had never had occasion to notice it was there. It only became visible when something contradicted it, the way a wall only becomes visible when you walk into it. 2 positions developed among the council members, and through the aide's increasingly candid reporting, I became aware of both of them within a week of the engineering meeting. The first position was that we should be studied, physiologically, neurologically, in as much detail as Calith science could access. The beings holding this position wanted to understand why humans did what we did, and whether the mechanism could be understood well enough to be replicated or applied to other beings through some form of modification or training. This position sounded, when stated neutrally, like intellectual curiosity. What it actually meant was that they wanted to understand us well enough to make us unnecessary. The second position was that we should be removed from the situation, not destroyed. The beings holding this position would not have described themselves as wanting anything destroyed, because that was not how they thought of themselves, but reclassified, transferred, contained at a safe distance from the Forge's ongoing operations. The argument was that our presence created uncertainty in a system that had been built to function without uncertainty, and that uncertainty was its own kind of risk. Gorzin did not belong to either position. He belonged to something that the 2 council factions could not quite get a clear view of, which I suspected was intentional. I began to understand his strategy about 2 months after the engineering meeting, in a conversation that was not quite a conversation. He came to the maintenance bay, while I was working on a secondary cooling system that had developed a pressure imbalance, and he stayed and watched me work for a while, and gradually began asking questions. Not questions that asked me directly to advise him, questions that approached the same territory from an angle that allowed him to receive the information without it being formally delivered. He asked what I thought about the Forge's overall output efficiency. I told him, impressive by any standard I had previous access to, but with 3 bottlenecks I had identified that seemed inconsistent with the rest of the operation's capability. He asked where the bottlenecks were. I told him in specific detail, with the locations and the mechanisms and what I thought was causing each one. He asked how I would approach them. I told him that too, walking through each one with the clarity I would have used talking to a colleague on the orbital yards, someone who understood machines and wanted to understand the problem. He listened to all of it, without writing anything down or asking his aide to record it. Then he left. 3 weeks later, every improvement I had described appeared in an official engineering report filed under the names of senior Calith technical staff. My name was not in the report. Yemi's conversation in the engineering meeting had been credited to the team collectively. Riku's medical bay recommissioning had been categorized as a routine maintenance achievement. I thought about this for a long time, about what it meant, whether it was exploitation or strategy or something that was both of those things at once and could not be separated into its parts. What I arrived at, after enough time sitting with it, was this. By filing our contributions under Calith names, Gorzin was keeping us out of a specific kind of visibility. The Oversight Council's 2 factions were both reacting to the evidence of what we could do. By reducing the visibility of that evidence, by routing it through the established credit system as though it had come from within that system, he was slowing the accumulation of that evidence in the places where it would force a decision. He was using us. There was no comfortable way to say otherwise. But I had also watched him stop at the memorial corridor in the lower section of the forge. a small, quiet alcove where the names of workers lost in industrial accidents over the decades had been recorded on a surface that had been maintained carefully through multiple administrative changes. I had watched him stand there for a considerable time, his secondary arms held close to his body, in the way I had identified as the Calith management of something internal. The names on the memorial were not all Calith. Some were Thureni. One was a species I could not identify. He had stopped at every one. I did not know what to do with that. I filed it somewhere and let it sit, the way Kowalski filed things that needed more space than the present moment could provide. What I knew concretely was this. 5 months in, we had fixed what Calith engineers could not fix, improved what they had given up improving, rebuilt a tunnel, recommissioned a medical bay, and begun to advance a 12-year military project that had been the most expensive and most visible failure in the Forge's recent history. We had accumulated knowledge not just of the Forge's physical systems, but of the systems of authority that ran it, the pressures those systems were under, and the places where those pressures had created the most stress. And somewhere in the Vorkai network, the field agent's footnote sat in a file that had not been widely read, unusual persistence behavior, a detail that the agent had not considered significant enough to follow. We were going to have to make it significant ourselves. We were getting better at that. The Vorkai envoy arrived without announcement in the early morning of a Thursday, and I know it was a Thursday because I had been keeping count on the inside of my bunk frame since the first week. A daily mark scratched with the corner of a calibration tool I had borrowed from the maintenance bay and not returned, because losing track of time felt like surrendering something I was not willing to surrender. I was not present when the envoy arrived. I heard about it from the aide 3 hours later, delivered in the careful, measured way the aide had developed for information it knew was going to require a significant response. The envoy's formal designation was long and full of sounds that did not translate cleanly. The aide referred to it simply as the Vorkai representative, which was accurate enough. It had arrived with a small delegation on a diplomatic trade vessel and requested a meeting with Gorzan's administrative council. The meeting had been held. The request delivered in the meeting was formal, structured, and dressed in diplomatic language, the kind of language that is chosen precisely because it communicates something specific while appearing to communicate something more general. What it communicated, stripped of the formal structure, was this: provide the 4 human acquisitions for species-level biological and cognitive study, to be conducted under Vorkai scientific authority. The stated purpose was the expansion of collective knowledge regarding sentient life. The actual purpose, as Riku noted that evening without bitterness, as a simple clinical observation, was to understand what we did well enough to prevent us from doing it, or to find the edges of what we could survive. Gorzan was given 72 hours to provide a response. The 4 of us sat in our quarters that night and talked about it the way we had learned to talk about serious things over 11 months of shared and unasked-for proximity, directly, without softening the edges, without going around the center of the problem. They are not interested in studying us, Riku said. The Vorkai acquire things. They do not study them. They find the limit of what a thing can do, and they use it up to that limit. Then the transfer cannot happen, Kowalski said. This was a statement of the situation, not an emotional declaration. The political problem, Yemi said, leaning forward slightly, with the particular quality of attention she brought to engineering problems, is that 2 of Gorzan's 7 council members have already been looking for a reason to have us removed. The Vorkai request provides a reason that is politically acceptable. They can support the transfer without appearing to act against Forge interests, because the request comes from outside, and they are simply accommodating an external political relationship. So we need to make us more valuable to keep than to give away, I said. Specifically, more valuable to the people inside the council who do not want us gone. The silence that followed was the particular kind of silence that happens when everyone in a room is thinking about the same thing from slightly different angles. The hull, Yemi said. There it was. The hull contract. 12 years of failure, now with a solution that had been proven in simulation, but had not yet been demonstrated in physical reality. The contract was one of the most politically significant commitments the Forge had made, carrying implications for the Empire's military position that extended well above the Forge's administrative level. If the hull could be proven physically, actually built and actually tested, not modeled, the contract value would override almost any other consideration in the Council's decision-making. We need to prove it in reality, I said. Build the prototype and run a live test, in front of everyone who matters. In 72 hours, Kowalski said. Yes. She looked at the ceiling for a moment, in the way she did when she was calculating something that other people would describe as impossible, and she was calculating as a logistics problem. Stop planning, she said. Start working. The first obstacle was authorization. We had not been asked to build the hull. The project had been in Telrock's engineering team's hands since Yemi identified the solution, and they had been implementing it through proper channels, at the careful pace that proper channels in Kalith engineering culture required. Proper channels were not going to produce a live test in 72 hours. I went to Gorzon directly. This was a departure from the pattern of our relationship, in which exchanges happened on his schedule and in contexts he initiated. His aide tried to stop me at the outer administrative corridor. I explained what I wanted, why I wanted it, and what the consequence was if the time frame passed without it happening. The aide made a communication. Gorzon saw me 11 minutes later. I stood in his office, clear surfaces, nothing present that was not functional, the air of a space maintained by someone who thought that excess was a form of inefficiency. And I told him what we were going to do, not proposed it, told him. I explained the parameters we needed, the access required, and the timeline we were operating against. I explained that if he authorized it and it succeeded, the hull contract would become the most significant asset available in any negotiation with the Vorkai or the Oversight Council. I explained that if it did not succeed, the failure would be no different from the 12 years of prior failure that had already been absorbed and documented and survived. He listened to all of it without expression and without interruption. You are describing a test that has not been planned, he said when I finished, designed by beings who do not hold authorization for the project, using equipment that has not been prepared for this purpose, in a time frame that is not compatible with any standard protocol. Yes, I said. The quiet lasted several seconds. What do you need? He said. I told him. The 63 hours that followed were the most demanding and concentrated period of work I have ever been part of, and I have been part of some very demanding work across 15 years, of building things that had to function in space. We divided the problem into 4 parallel tracks, because we did not have time for anything sequential. Kowalski took the structural problem. The hull prototype needed to be mounted in the test dock in a configuration that could absorb the stress of what we were going to ask it to absorb, without transmitting that stress to the dock structure itself, in ways the dock was not designed to handle. The test dock's mounting system was not built for this. She redesigned it from first principles in 4 hours, on paper, working from her assessment of the dock structure she had spent 2 weeks observing from the adjacent transit corridor. Then she spent 16 hours building the changes into the physical dock, directing a team of Kalith workers operating under Gorzon's authorization, and occasional expressions of concern that she addressed with the same patient precision she brought to everything structural. The concern did not recur after the 3rd time she explained the physics in terms that were impossible to argue with. Yemi worked with Telrock's team on translating the hull configuration from simulation parameters to physical construction. The simulation had identified the optimal discontinuity parameters under modeled conditions. Physical construction was not modeled conditions. It involved materials that behaved with small but significant deviations from their modeled properties, under certain manufacturing processes, tools that were not perfectly matched to the specifications they were trying to achieve, and judgment calls that had to be made quickly and not revisited. Yemi made every call clearly, explained her reasoning once, and did not return to a decision after it was made. This was an approach that Telrock, watching her work, observed with an attention I had learned to recognize as a form of respect, expressed through close study, rather than through any verbal acknowledgement. Riku managed something that sounded less critical than it was. 63 hours is a long time to work at full capacity. The decisions that get made in hour 50 are not the same quality as the decisions made in hour 10, and bad decisions in the construction of a military hull prototype are not recoverable on the schedule we were running. He moved continuously between the teams involved in the work, the 4 of us, the Kalith workers, Telrock's engineers, monitoring the quality of attention and judgment in each group, intervening when he identified someone pushing past a threshold where their thinking was no longer reliable. He twice recalibrated the reactor monitoring system that was going to power the test, because the test required output levels that the reactor's standard safety protocols would not authorize, and he had identified an adjustment to the monitoring parameters that preserved the actual safety margins while removing the artificial ceiling that the standard protocols imposed. The engineers argued that this was not possible. He explained why it was. They stopped arguing. My track was the coupling. The central energy coupling connecting the hull prototype to the power supply was not rated for the test parameters we needed. It was the correct type of coupling for this type of system. The design was right, the function was right, but the alloy it was made from had been chosen for normal operational loads, not for the sustained extreme loads we needed it to carry. Under our test conditions, based on my calculations, it would fail at approximately the 40-minute mark. We needed it to hold for at least 70 minutes. There were no replacement couplings in the required specification anywhere in the facility's inventory. There was no time to source them from elsewhere. I rebuilt the coupling from different materials. This requires more explanation than that sentence contains, but the important part is this. I had to calculate load-bearing tolerances for alloys I had never worked with before, using material property specifications I derived from reference data that was incomplete, and machined the finished component entirely by hand, because the automated fabrication systems were occupied with hull construction and could not be diverted to a secondary task on this timeline. I machined it in 4 hours, and the precision it required was the kind of precision that cannot be rushed without being destroyed. So the 4 hours were 4 hours of sustained concentration that I have not experienced before or since. I tested it 3 times when I was done. It tested correctly each time. I installed it, and then I stood back and looked at the hull sitting in the dock that Kowalski had rebuilt, and I thought something that I cannot quite put into words, except to say that it felt like standing at the edge of a very specific kind of answer. Either the answer would be yes or it would be no, and both answers were honest, and honest was the only thing the situation had room for. On the 64th hour, with 8 hours remaining before Gorzin's response deadline, the test ran. Every observation feed that could be redirected to the test bay had been redirected, because Gorzin had arranged it that way in the hours before the test, quietly and without announcement. Every council member, every military official present at the forge on other business, including 3 senior officers whose presence on the attendance log for that day I had noticed because Yemi had told me to look for them. Everyone who held a position on what should happen to the 4 humans who had been purchased at the lowest price in the exchange's history was watching. The test parameters were 240% of the hull's rated operational load. That number represented our calculation of what we needed to demonstrate in order to prove the hull was not merely improved, but categorically different from what had existed before. We were not interested in a marginal demonstration. We wanted something that could not be reinterpreted as incremental progress. The test ran for 89 minutes. The hull held. It held at 240% for 89 minutes, and then we ended the test, because we had more than enough data, and the question had been answered. But it did not just hold, which was the part that none of us had predicted. The deliberate discontinuities in the plating, as the load increased, began to interact with each other in a pattern that Yemi had not modeled, because the interaction was an emergent property of the physical system that the simulation had not captured. The boundary points were not simply absorbing the load, they were communicating with each other through the plating structure in a way that increased the hull's effective resistance as the load climbed. The harder the test pushed, the more the boundaries worked together. The more they worked together, the stronger the hull became under that specific type of force. Telrock, watching from the observation platform, said something to the engineer beside him. The translator rendered it as, "This behavior is not consistent with standard structural theory." Yemi said quietly, standing beside me at the monitoring station. Standard theory was built from a set of assumptions. We used different assumptions. The political sequence that followed the test was rapid, by Calith standards, which meant it happened over a few hours, rather than a few days. The council met. The faction that had been most loudly in favor of accommodating the Vorkai request discovered that it was now in the position of arguing against its own political interests, because the hull contract's new demonstrated reality made the humans responsible for it the most valuable sovereign asset the Forge currently held, and transferring sovereign assets under active military contract was a legally and politically much more difficult thing than transferring 4 beings who had simply been useful in a general way. The Vorkai representative was informed that the requested transfers were not possible under Kalith Imperial Sovereign Asset Law as it applied to beings directly involved in active classified military production. The representative left with what the aide described as diplomatic restraint that appeared to be under significant internal pressure. Gorzin came to the test bay while we were beginning post-test documentation. He walked around the hull slowly, in his measuring way. He stopped in front of the coupling I had rebuilt from the wrong materials with the wrong tools in 4 hours, in the middle of the night. It was not beautiful. It was functional, and it was strong, and it had done what it needed to do for the full 89 minutes. That was everything that had been asked of it, and I was not unhappy with it. He looked at it for a while, in the way he looked at things that interested him. The title of Forge Master, he said without turning from the coupling, has not been awarded to anyone outside the founding bloodlines in 400 years. The documentation is being prepared. It will be filed in the Imperial Registry within 48 hours as irrevocable sovereign record. He turned from the coupling and walked toward the bay entrance. All 4 of you, he said without stopping. He left. I looked at my hands. The burns from the coupling work, 2 on the back of my right hand, 1 on my palm, the kind that would leave marks I would still be able to see years from now. The grease that had worked its way into every crease. The cuts along 3 knuckles from metal edges I had not moved away from quickly enough. The shake that was still present, the kind that comes from sustained fine work, at a level of concentration that leaves the body running at a higher level than it knows how to come down from quickly. Forge Master. I laughed. I had not planned to laugh, and the sound of it surprised me. And then Kowalski laughed too. Not the controlled, filed-away kind of sound she usually made, but an actual laugh, short and real. Riku smiled in that wide, slow way he had, the expression he kept for moments that were genuinely good. Yemi shook her head with the expression she wore when something had happened that she found technically significant and was still processing. We were still property, and I needed to be honest about that. The legal category had not changed. What had changed was the content of the category, the protections, the standing, the capacity to negotiate and refuse, the irrevocable nature of a title that put us into a legal classification that the Empire's own law required it to protect. It was not freedom, but it was the furthest thing from scrap price I had ever imagined we would reach. And in the Kalith Empire, things that were inconvenient had a way of becoming, over time, impossible to remove. I am recording this in our quarters on Drave 4. The date, by my count, is the 394th day since capture, which I have been calling month 14 because months are a human measurement, and I am still a human, regardless of what any Imperial registry says. I am recording into a transmission device that Yemi built over 3 months of evening work, using components assembled from the facility in small enough quantities that no single acquisition triggered any inventory alert. The transmission is on a Vorkai band frequency, set to repeat on a rotation that should reach at least a dozen relay points across a wide arc of space. I do not know which relay points are connected to anything that will eventually route toward Earth. I know the math says at least one of them probably is, and probably is good enough when eventually is the only timeline available. My name is Marcus Hale. I was a machinist on Earth's northern orbital shipyard. This is a record of what has happened since, addressed to whoever receives it first. The formal documentation of the Forge Master title was filed in the Imperial Registry of Kalith Sovereign Assets 31 days after the hull test. The documentation is irrevocable under the specific provisions of Kalith Imperial law that governs sovereign asset classification, which means it cannot be reversed without a review process requiring the agreement of a majority of the Imperial Architects' Council, a body that has not convened to reverse such a classification in the past 400 years. The title carries legal protections that apply to all 4 of us. We cannot be transferred to another owner without individual consent. We cannot be reclassified to a lower status category without formal review. Our working conditions are governed by the standards applied to founding bloodline forge masters, who are the highest protected class of workers in the Empire's industrial code. We are still technically property. I say this clearly and without softening because being accurate about the actual situation is more useful than presenting it as something it is not. The legal category of sovereign asset still sits within the broader framework of the Kalith system of acquired labor, which is what it is regardless of how it is described. What has changed is everything inside that category. The protections, the standing, the rights of refusal, and negotiation that come with a title that was designed to protect the Empire's most valued workers from being treated carelessly by those who might not appreciate their value. Gorzin built this for us through a combination of legal knowledge, political positioning, and a pragmatic understanding of what the Forge's continued success required. He used us to do it. I have made my peace with that, in the way that you make peace with complicated things, when the alternative is carrying them in a way that makes it harder to work. He also, in the same period, quietly ensured that the memorial in the lower corridor received 3 new names from the post-test cleanup period, all properly recorded in the species-appropriate format for each, which was a thing that did not need to happen, and that no one required of him, and that he arranged himself. People are not simple. I knew this before any of this happened. I know it more fully now. Kowalski left 16 days ago. A Kalith territorial lord named Vethrak, who administers a settlement territory on the storm planet Cavil 3, had heard the story of the tunnel that had been declared permanently blocked, that Kowalski had improved by making it worse first, and he brought the story to Gorzin with a specific request. There was a bridge city on one of Cavil 3's equatorial ridges, built to house 11,000 inhabitants, and it was failing. The structural engineers who had built it had not adequately accounted for the specific harmonic load patterns created by the planet's continuous storm systems, and the settlement was now in a progression toward full structural collapse that the available Kalith engineering teams had not been able to stop or adequately slow. Vethrak had heard that there was a human who destroyed structures on purpose and then built better ones from the pieces. Kowalski heard the problem described. She asked 3 technical questions about the storm cycle frequency, the bridge city's primary load-bearing configuration, and the timeline before the next major storm season. Then she said she would go. Before she left, she came to my door very early in the morning, before the first shift noise had started. She stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at me with the expression she wore when she was about to say something she had decided was worth saying. "Don't wait for me to come back," she said. "Keep going." "I know," I said. She nodded once. Then she was gone. 7 days after she left, the aide received an administrative communication from Vethrak's office, indicating that stabilization work was progressing ahead of the projected timeline, and that the specialist involved had submitted a request for additional ordnance for what the communication described as a secondary stabilization approach that the filing engineer considered innovative. The Kalith official who processed the request had added a note expressing uncertainty about whether the approach was sound, which I found straightforwardly reassuring. Kowalski is fine. Yemi is entirely fine in every sense of the word fine that matters, which means she is deep inside a problem that has not been solved yet, and she is in exactly the right place. She has been working since the hull test on a comprehensive redesign of the Forge's power distribution system. The current system was designed approximately 40 years ago, and has been maintained since, through successive layers of patches and workarounds, each patch addressing a specific problem, without reference to the patches that came before it, until the accumulated patchwork obscures the original system to the point where it is no longer clearly visible underneath. The original design logic has been buried under decades of incremental correction. Yemi is removing the patches, not all at once, sequentially, methodically, with the patience of someone who knows that the work will take as long as it takes, and that taking less time by cutting corners is not actually taking less time. It is borrowing time that will have to be repaid later with interest. As each layer of patchwork comes away, she rebuilds what was under it in a way that accounts for everything that was learned during the period when the patchwork was necessary. The redesign is not a restoration of the original system. It is a new system that knows what the original system did not know yet. She showed me the current state of it 2 nights ago. The clarity of it, every part serving its function, every connection between parts visible and legible, the whole system comprehensible from any starting point, in a way that meant any person who needed to understand it could understand it, was the kind of clarity that only comes when someone has genuinely thought a thing through to its deepest level and then designed from that level outward. "This will run for 60 years without major modification," she said. I looked at 3 of the interface points she had shown me, and I thought about how they would age, and I said, 70. She looked at the interface points. Then she wrote something in her notes. Riku's medical ward is treating Kalith civilians. I return to this sentence often because it continues to feel significant in a way that is different from the Hull test or the tunnel or the title. The Hull test changed our legal status. The tunnel demonstrated what human problem-solving looked like applied to structural failure. The title gave us standing within a system that had not had a category for us before. But Riku's ward demonstrates something else. It demonstrates what happens when a human being decides that the most important thing is for the work to help the person in front of them, regardless of what species that person belongs to, regardless of the system's assumptions about who deserves what kind of care. He built the ward for cross-species treatment because the Forge's existing medical infrastructure was designed for Kalith physiology and was therefore inadequate for the Thereni workers, the Sketh workers, and others whose biology did not match the assumption built into the system. He fixed this problem because it needed fixing, and he was capable of fixing it. He built a cross-species assessment approach from first principles, recalibrating it to the biological parameters he had spent months learning, creating protocols for types of care that had no established precedent in the facility's medical history. The ward now treats approximately 90 patients per month. More than 60 of them are Kalith workers. These are beings who had access to the existing Kalith medical facility and could have gone there instead. They come to Riku's ward because the care there is measurably better, because a human surgeon who did not know anything about Kalith biology 14 months ago learned it, and built something from that learning that now operates at a higher standard than the facility that has been running for 3 decades. He is currently training 3 Kalith medical technicians in his assessment methodology. He told me last week that one of them has a particular gift for sustained diagnostic attention, the ability to stay focused and receptive over the long period of observation that good diagnostic work requires, which is different from the ability to act quickly and precisely that emergency medicine requires, and which is harder to teach. I asked whether he was trying to make himself replaceable. No, he said. I am trying to make the method survive me. I have thought about that sentence every day since he said it. I think it is the most important thing anyone has said to me in 14 months. Not make yourself indispensable. Make the method survive. Build something that continues after you are gone, that carries forward what you understood, and makes it available to the next person who needs it, regardless of whether you are present to explain it. I am still at the machines. This is the most accurate sentence I can write about my own situation. The scale has changed significantly since the first week. I am working on systems now that I was not cleared to approach in those early months. Systems whose function matters to the Forge's operation, at a level that makes the plasma mill spindle look like the learning exercise it was. But the work itself is the same work. I take things apart and understand how they work and fix them, and when fixing reveals something that can be improved, I improve it. Last week I completed a redesign of the primary fabrication line's feed mechanism that had been causing intermittent jams for 3 years. The intermittent nature of the problem, it happened unpredictably, could not be reliably reproduced on demand, and left no consistent physical evidence after each occurrence, had made it nearly impossible for the engineering team to diagnose using standard methods, because standard diagnostic methods require the problem to be present in order to measure it. I watched the line run for 2 days. I watched it specifically for what happened in the moments before a jam would have occurred if it had been going to occur. The micro variations in feed rate, the tiny positional deviations in the material being fed, the subtle vibration patterns that preceded irregular behavior. I built a picture of the problem from its edges rather than its center. When I had enough of the edges, the center became visible. The fix took 4 hours to implement once I knew what the problem was. The line has not jammed since, which is a period of 11 days and counting. The Kalith engineer who had been assigned responsibility for that line for the past 3 years came to me 2 days after the fix was implemented. She stood in the maintenance bay with the careful formality that Kalith professional interactions maintain, and said something that the translator rendered as, "The approach you use to identify the problem is not in any diagnostic methodology I have studied." "No," I said, "it is not a standard method. Where did you learn it?" I thought about this for a moment. "I learned it from a machine that would not tell me directly what was wrong with it," I said. "I had to find it by looking at everything around the problem, until the problem became visible from the outside." She was quiet for a moment. "Would you explain the approach in more detail?" she said. "I would like to understand how it works." I spent 2 hours explaining it. She asked good questions. Several of her questions made me articulate things I had understood at a practical level, without having fully worked out how to describe them, which was useful for me as well as for her. This is what I find myself thinking about most, in the time between the machines and the sleep that does not always come easily in a place that is not home, and may not be home again for a very long time. Not the title, not the political maneuvering, not the test, though the test still matters, and will continue to matter, for reasons that extend well beyond this facility. I think about the engineer asking me to explain the approach. I think about Riku's technicians learning the methodology. I think about Yemi's system that will run for 70 years. I think about Kowalski on Caval 3, applying something she learned in a 30-meter collapsed tunnel to a bridge city failing under harmonic storm load. We came here with no schematics. We came with nothing that the system that bought us knew how to value. We came with hands and training and the specific, stubborn, unreasonable human insistence on continuing to look for solutions, even when the established methods have been exhausted, and the engineers have filed the report and closed the folder. And in 14 months, the things we built from that, the approaches and the methods and the habits of mind that the field agent noticed in a footnote and could not quite categorize, those things are beginning to move outward from Dravid 4, in ways I can see, and in ways I cannot see. The aide told me 3 weeks ago that a Kalith territorial administrator in a sector I had not previously heard of had filed an inquiry about the human acquisitions in one of his facilities. A small group, acquired through a different channel from ours, assigned to basic maintenance work, and categorized under standard acquired labor classifications. The inquiry was about reclassification based on demonstrated contribution to industrial output. I do not know the outcome. The aide did not know it either. But the inquiry happened, and someone filed it, and that is the kind of thing that does not stop once it starts. I do not know if Earth will be free. I want to say this clearly, and without the false comfort of pretending certainty I do not have. I do not know the shape of what is coming, or how long it will take to arrive. I am a machinist. I know how to assess material. What can be worked, what cannot, what will hold under load, and what will fail when the pressure reaches a certain point. And the honest assessment is that I am not certain about the scale of what stands between the present moment and anything that could be called freedom for the species I come from. What I know is smaller and more immediate, and I think, more important as a starting point. I know that every species in this facility has now seen what happens when humans are given broken things and told to do what they can. I know that Riku's ward exists and is treating beings whose biology he had to learn from scratch. I know that Yemi's hull is being built and that the 12-year silence at the test dock has been replaced by the sound of construction. I know that Kowalski is on a storm planet doing something that the filing engineer called innovative in a tone that suggested they were not entirely sure whether to be alarmed. I know what the Vorkai paid for us, because I was in the staging area when it happened, and I heard the auctioneer repeat the number twice to confirm it had been transmitted correctly. I know what we are worth now, and the distance between those two numbers is the whole story. So here is what I want to say, to whoever gets this first, in whatever condition this reaches you, across whatever distance it has to travel to arrive. We were purchased as broken stock. We were brought to the forge the way you bring material you intend to test to failure, to find out what it does when it comes apart. And we came apart, a little. 14 months is a long time to be held in a place you did not choose, working for purposes that were not yours, in service of a system that did not think of you as a person. That is real. I am not going to describe it as anything else. But what we also did was take the broken things they gave us and fix them. And when fixing revealed something that could be improved, we improved it. And when improvement showed us something about the system that was running below the visible surface, we kept looking at it until we understood it. And when we understood it, we used that understanding carefully and precisely, and in ways that could not be easily reversed. We did not wait to be given permission to understand. We did not wait to be told that understanding was allowed. We did not accept that the established methods were the only methods, or that the problems declared unsolvable were in fact unsolvable, or that the price paid at an auction represented anything real about what we were capable of. We kept trying, we failed, and we used the failure, and we tried differently, and we kept going, until the problem answered us, or we found a different question to ask it. That is the footnote. Unusual persistence behavior. Continues attempting solutions after failure, rather than rerouting to established alternative pathways. That is the thing the field agent noticed, and could not quite categorize, and filed as potentially significant, and moved on from. That is us. Find the thing they think you cannot fix. Find the machine that has been declared beyond repair, the tunnel that has been sealed and left, the project that has been running for 12 years without producing an answer, the ward that has been dark for a decade. Find it and look at it the way I looked at the spindle on the floor of the maintenance bay, not for what it was supposed to be, but for what it actually was, and what that told you about where the function had stopped, and what stood between the stopping and the starting again. Fix it with whatever you have. Fix it with the wrong tools. Fix it from the wrong materials. Fix it by making it worse before you make it better, if that is what the structure of the problem requires. Fix it on timelines that the established methods would describe as impossible, because the established methods were not built by people who had no other option. Make the methods survive you. Pass on what you learn. Teach it to the person who asks good questions and stays late to understand the answer. And then charge them for it, not in money, in standing. In the irrevocable accumulation of demonstrated evidence that the assessment was wrong, that the scrap price was wrong, that the silence from the gallery at the Vorkai Sovereign Exchange was the most expensive mistake anyone in that room ever made. My name is Marcus Hale. I was a machinist on Earth's northern orbital shipyard. I am a forge master of the Calith Empire. I am still at the machines. And if you are hearing this, whoever you are, we are still here, and we are still going, and the footnote was right.